Cool.
No, yeah. What should we talk about? Well,
Yeah, well, I want to talk about Formula One. So
yeah,
I am brand spanking new to this whole world. Like a lot of American people, I watched the Netflix documentary
yeah.
and was just like, this is awesome. And I have a sports psychology channel, so like that was part of the motivation for doing that in the first place, just because I just wanted to see like what all the hubbub was about. Um, and just thought it was really interesting and really cool, and loved the whole like focusing on the drivers as sort of like characters and people. And then when I went out to try and find some like literature on like the psychology of Formula One drivers, that was actually a lot harder than I expected. There's not a ton of like actual academic work that's been done on that, but I did find your article for the actual Formula One website, and then like saw your books and all that stuff.
I know, right. That's yeah.
So I'm gonna reach out to this guy. So um, yeah, I guess that's my first question. It's just like, what is like sort of the nature of your work in this field? How long have you been a fan of Formula One? All that kind of stuff.
Sure. I mean, well, in my case, you can blame Ayrton Senna for all of this because as a sort of teenager, he was my kind of ultimate hero of pretty much anything. I was a fan of all the sports, but he really blew my mind as an amazing kind of Brazilian guy who not only was a genius at what he did on the track, he was an incredibly good communicator about what he went through, how he did it, and all these things. And he had this one particular description he gave of the lap he did around Monaco in 1988, where he was, or it's a set series of laps. Qualifying then was worked like that, and he was just going faster and faster and faster. And it took him about a year before he started talking about what happened during that. But he was then speaking to a Canadian journalist called Jerry Donaldson, who and just told him, like, he was describing this sort of mystical state he was reaching, where he just kept pushing and he kept finding more and he kept finding more, and he thought he was at the limit, and then he just went a little bit further, and then he was then reaching states where he'd never reached before, and he didn't really understand how it was happening. He was just letting it happen, and he almost described having had an out of body experience while it was going on. And then eventually reached a point where it scared him. He was on pole by miles, a second and a half ahead of Alain Prost in an identical McLaren, and Alain Prost was no slouch. He was a serious racer, but he had to pull into the pits because he sort of reached a level of understanding he'd never been to before. So that was what inspired this guy to get into Formula One, and I mean, I arrived in the paddock sadly a few years too late to meet Ayrton Senna. I got there in the late 90s, but I was there basically going around the place working as a journalist, but using every spare minute I could to try and collar every single Formula One driver I could find to find out, okay, have you reached this kind of level before? Maybe not Senna level, but have you had this experience? Do you recognize it? And to my incredible shock, they all had, in some way or other, they'd all had this experience. I mean, and not always necessarily in the Monaco Grand Prix, but in somewhere along the way, they had an experience where it was just literally kind of blew their mind. Because this sort of state of mind, you find it in all sports. In the zone, is the most sort of frequent way of describing it. But there's all sorts of others. But it's this sort of magical state where all thinking stops, and all the years of training that you've worked on for all these years, and they all have, because especially nowadays, everybody starts in karting pretty much age of 4 or 5. And they're doing it all the way up. So they know their stuff and they're all brilliant. But all those years, to get it all back out again when it really matters, they have to just kind of have a state of mind that is completely free of anything. And it just lets it all flood back out. And we see the results from the outside. We see amazing, in other sports, we see an amazing, perfect gymnastics routine, or, just a magical move in a team sport. But from a motor racing perspective, we see on the lap charts, obviously it's going to be a quick lap or it's going to be a quick race. But this, and we love it to watch. That's what draws us into sport, is to see these amazing moments. But the joy that we get is nothing compared to the joy that these guys get from the inside. Because when they're having these moments, it's practically heaven on earth. They describe this sort of state of just pure perfection. It's like almost a spiritual thing. Certainly with Senna, he described it in spiritual terms, and other drivers don't necessarily all have the same amazing ability to communicate. But my goodness, they've all been there in some stage or other. And that's the magic that I've been chasing for now, getting on 25 years. And yeah, every time I speak to these people, it gives me goosebumps as well. And then I try and sort of get it down on paper somehow. And then as I say, I put them in a couple of books now of just collections of these interviews, one completely about Formula One, and then one about expanding into all the other sports, trying to find legends of all the different sports. But yeah, it's a pretty special state. The rest of us can get there as well. But if you're doing it in a Formula One car around Monaco, that is a really special state.
So when Senna's giving these quotes to like a Canadian journalist, is he giving them in English or in Portuguese?
Yeah, that's the amazing thing about Senna. He was doing that interview in English. He could speak four languages pretty much perfectly. And the thing about Senna is when he was saying something important, and you'd see this sometimes in the press conferences going back to those days, the ones that were recorded, he gets misty-eyed and he gets sort of like it's tears come into his eyes, and he starts sort of really kind of, if he knows he's saying something important, no matter what language, the world knows it as well. And Jerry Donaldson, who later practically became a friend of mine when I was working in Formula One, I got to speak to him about this interview, and he was saying that Senna during this was going really misty-eyed, and then after that he started talking about how his entire relationship with spirituality, God, everything else had all changed basically based on that moment. So yeah, he was an incredible had an incredible ability to communicate. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, sounds like it. So in all of your discussions with Formula One drivers, I'm thinking the early 2000s, like you said, as a journalist, like who was your favorite guy to talk to about this kind of stuff?
God, there were quite a few of this, because I mean, luckily I was able to speak to everybody from like the era of like Sterling Moss going back to the 50s when they were really kind of living dangerously as well. I mean, the sport still has an element of danger, but it's not to the same level as it was back then, where people were sort of dying pretty regularly every season. So I mean, so people like that were inspiring, because they were finding these moments despite knowing that their life was on the line. And in a sense, also that's what daredevils and action sports people these days also get. It's such a classic thing to get in the zone in those moments where your life is literally on the line. But then coming through to more closer to our era, I mean, I was lucky to get the very start of Lewis's career, and I always loved speaking to Lewis about this. I mean, in fact, I was at a test. His very first test for McLaren in Formula One was at the Valencia circuit in Spain, and it was a private test. I just happened to be doing a job for McLaren, and I just grabbed Lewis at it and sat him down. And I mean, he was even then. So this is before he'd done his first Formula One race, but he'd done what was then GP2, the equivalent of Formula 2, and all these other series coming up, and he was obviously dominating pretty much everything. He had already sort of experienced this state of being in the zone many times. And then, you know, he was also a massive Senna fan and still is. And when I was talking to him about that experience that Senna had described, he sort of sighed a bit and then said, "Oh man, that's beyond the zone. That's heaven." You know, so it's just like he gets it. He's always got it. And as he then went on throughout his career and kept winning and winning and winning, and sometimes not winning, sometimes having a frustrating year like he is at the moment, but he also had early days as well in McLaren having similar years. But the moments when it all comes together, he still recognizes them. And he had, I think, one particularly one in like 2021, I think, in Spain, and he actually was describing it very much in terms of being in the zone and how, you know, he was just talking in a very similar way to it. And actually, so yeah, I don't know. I've been treated very, very well, because if you're in the Formula One paddock, you literally have every great of the sport walking past you, and they're enclosed in this sort of area, so you can pretty much just grab anyone. It's yeah, if you're a fan of the sport, you can never find your way into the paddock. My goodness, you're just in heaven. So yeah, but there's a couple at least.
I was going to ask you, did you get to meet Nikki Lauda?
Yeah, I did. Now, what did Nikki say? He was, yeah, I met him a couple of times. He was very much of the era, obviously, going back more to the Sterling Moss type thing of, because as he well found out, he had lived dangerously and he very nearly died in a massive crash at the Nürburgring. What was he saying? He was very much of the sort of, he reminded me of Sterling Moss, because these guys who had sort of lived through those danger years, they sort of loved the danger. They kind of loved the or Sterling was in particular was sort of saying, oh, it wouldn't be the same sport without it. I don't know how these guys still manage now when they're basically going to crash, roll over 15 times and still walk out and walk back to the paddock. But Nikki Lauda, I mean, just an amazing human being, just incredibly intelligent and incredibly. When you live through something like that, where you're basically given the last rites by a priest, told you're on your way out, then you come back, and he came back and then still won world championships. It takes a pretty special individual, and Nikki Lauda was definitely one of those. Yeah.
So, like, what are these teams, and you may know this, you may not, like, what are these teams doing? Because I would assume this is kind of a collective goal of everybody's, so, like, how can we put these drivers in a position to where they can actually be in the zone and not have to think? Because, like, I've already done a video on Formula One where I was talking about just the, like, why it's so exciting and sort of all of the various stimuli that each driver has to deal with on a particular lap. But a big part of, I would think, of sort of the psychological underpinnings of what those teams do is to try and get them away from that, where they're having to, like, actively process, okay, here's what I need to be doing with my gear shift. Here's, like, the numbers I need to be paying attention to. I've got my team principal talking in my ear. I've got to be paying attention to the other drivers around me. Can I overtake? Like, all of that kind of stuff at once. But hopefully the goal would be to sort of streamline all of that into a kind of in the zone experience. But what do teams do to try and, like, make that happen, if that makes any sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And it's a sport where it's really hard. I mean, it's a sport where, most, say, a boxer or a tennis player, they, in the sort of half hour before, or the hour maybe before a big event, they're left to themselves. They are literally just focusing to get in that zone. And that's all they do, because it's such a critical state to be in. A Formula One driver is on a grid where he's interviewed by 10 different people, showing microphones in his face. He's obviously got his engineers telling him, okay, we've got this such and such happening on lap 24. You've got to be ready for that, blah, blah, blah. Get this all in your mind. All these things are still happening. I mean, most of the team stuff is done earlier than that, but a driver's still got to be ready to take on board all this stuff while dealing with all these other things. So the teams increasingly do have psychologists and people who are specialists in this area. But it's actually been quite a slow process in Formula One compared to, say, golfers and tennis players who sometimes bring whole teams of just psychologists, personally. And it's Formula One was a bit late to the game in that, because it's partly a kind of a match, I think that during the sort of, during these earlier years, as we were describing, they wouldn't have, no, you can't help me. You can't help me with some sort of psychologist. I do my own psychology. And to a sense, they still do. But the best thing about these Formula One drivers is that they are able to assimilate all this information and then sort of narrow it down to know that they only need 3 bits of that information to stick in their head for when they're actually out there. And they are brilliant at managing that, and I think also these days, because they've grown up with it, even going down to sort of Formula 3 and lower levels karting, it's so well known now that the mind basically controls everything, that these real sort of career drivers who are going to make it all the way to the top have generally had now sort of introduction to this psychology from a really early age. And so they know how to manage themselves. And in the past, it was just left up to the guys and just do it. And they just coped. And some of them cope better than others. But these days, there are sort of teams of people working on it. And it's a big part of the weekend. It's because the weekend goes up and down. You have the qualifying, you have the practice sessions, everything else. And then it comes to this big peak with the race. And they've all got to be ready to go on that. And to a lesser extent, at the sort of the medium highs along the way, the qualifyings and all these things. The teams are becoming increasingly expert at it, but it's still a big job, because the drivers have got to then, despite all this stuff coming in their heads, and during the race as well, radio communications, all this stuff, they've still got to do the job that they've been doing for 30 odd years or 20 odd years, to just be brilliant and push to the limit on every single corner they get to. If that helps.
No, yeah, it does. And you mentioned something that, like, has been probably one of my favorite sort of discoveries, which I probably could have guessed but there's just like this incredible amount of testosterone, and like they talked about this like fighter pilot mentality a lot in Drive to Survive of the men. And one of my favorite things about it is it's cross cultural. Like you could have talking to like Kevin Magnussen, who's Danish, and then you get Lando Norris or Valtteri Bottas, whoever, and like they pretty much all share this regardless of where they're from. So what's been your experience with that, and just like how it affects drivers and how it makes the sport more entertaining?
Well, it certainly makes it more entertaining. I mean, I would say it's probably, even despite the fact that there's still a lot of testosterone out there, it's I'd say it's managed better than it was. I mean, I can't remember, when did they last? Did any? Oh no, I take it all back. Sometimes they do still get out of the car and want to fight each other, don't they? But it's interesting. You take someone like Max Verstappen, whose dad was also pretty feisty as a driver. He was around sort of the late 90s, and he learned a lot because he was up against Michael Schumacher, and as eventually the number 2 driver to him in the Benetton team in the 90s. And so he learned a lot about how to craft the perfect Formula One driver. He has basically shown he learned that pretty well, because Max has basically been brought up in that world, and look at him now. So Max has this. If I was talking about an aggressive driver, he'd probably be the one that springs to mind of the current era. And because I don't know how much of that is just his dad. It probably isn't. It's very much probably an internal thing for all Formula One drivers. But it's an interesting thing, actually, an interesting dynamic with him and his dad, because it's very similar to, if you look at the Williams sisters, and their dad was very much sort of the driver behind their amazing success in tennis. And Jos has obviously driven Max all the way through, basically crafting him into being a potential world champion. And so all along he's had the belief that he's going to do it. He's been told basically since he was 3, 4, I don't know, but you will be a world champion one day. That's an incredibly powerful thing. That happened to the Williams sisters as well. They were told really young, you will be Wimbledon champions. When you have that in your mentality from a really early age, the belief that comes from it is huge. And belief is so important in sport, and so important in anything. And so when Max sometimes gets pushed out of his what he's expecting to do, which is basically to win every race. And at the moment, he is winning every race, which is fine. But obviously, he hadn't had that all the way through. It's quite easy to unsettle. And then there are some sporting success stories who've been kind of maybe pushed by their parents as well. I mean, Andre Agassi springing to mind. I don't know if you've read Open, his book, where he basically said that he hated tennis because he was pushed into it by his dad, and he was basically he was a tortured soul throughout, despite looking like he was having the time of his life. So Max Verstappen, yeah. I don't think he's a tortured soul. I think he's quite enjoying it at the moment. But at some point or other, he will face a time again where there is another car that's challenging him, and maybe it's in a couple of seasons' time, his car won't be at the top, and he'll be the one struggling along like people like Lewis are doing this year. And then it'll be interesting to see how he manages his amazing mentality there. He's obviously got an incredible mentality, and testosterone is part of it, and using it in the right way.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you talked about the dad angle too, because I'm working on a video about Tiger Woods right now, who's like influenced by his father. But they're like, especially in the current, I say especially, in the current grid, there are several drivers like Carlos Sainz who like had really famous dads in motorsports, and like have just kind of like been around this for their entire life. Mick Schumacher, I think he's a reserve driver this year, but like he's still like in the frame. So that's an interesting point that these guys, because like in my mind, it's not just a nepotism thing where like sponsors are going to be like more likely to pick up Mick Schumacher because his name is Mick Schumacher, and like sort of carry him through in a way that maybe another driver like Lewis Hamilton might not. But It's also just that familiarity aspect, and which to me makes it a lot easier for someone who's just like grown up around this and is kind of used to it to like get to sort of if not the zone, like a zone adjacent type mentality where, again, like, the stimuli that they're experiencing are not going to affect them as much potentially.
You're right. I mean, and it is a mixture as well, because I mean, I'm sure you're going to get a lot easier path, but you're obviously going to get more openings if you've got a famous surname, and you see it more probably in Formula One than pretty much any other sport, because I mean, you don't see it in football very often, or I'm to my English soccer, and there's it's these huge sports, these huge global sports where anybody can find themselves a football or whatever and just kick it around, or a basketball. It's pretty rare to get a sort of a dynasty going. Whereas in motor racing on both sides of the Atlantic, actually, there's some pretty famous dynasties going on. So it's a mixture. It's because it's such a specialized thing. To have a knowledge of what it's about to perform at the highest level clearly is a massive head start. To actually be around that when you're young, maybe going along to the races with your dad and seeing how it all works is obviously, again, a massive head start. But then to have a parent who, with the will to push you all the way and to help support you all the way, and the financial side as well, all comes into it in this sport, means that it's probably not it's not a level playing field like it would be in a lot of other sports. So these people do have a lift, and there is an element of it, but because they are there and learning from such a young age, it's a massive benefit as well. I mean, that is probably even more key, that they're put in carts when they're tiny, and B, they're supported all the way by somebody who knows what it takes to reach all the way. And yeah, so it's both, but it certainly helps have a very famous name in Formula One.
Yeah, like, you have the name element, you have the genetic element too, of like having the like reaction speed, like being able to like actually do the activity. Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that about like, and maybe not like translating as well to something like football. It's like, I'm trying to think of an example. Like the first one that comes to mind is Frank Lampard, and that's a bad example in the world.
No, it's not a bad example, actually. Yeah, they were both good players. So yeah, but it's a rare thing. It's really rare. You get maybe one or two, say, footballers in the whole league, whereas in a Formula One grid, you may have, as you say, we've already got two, like we've thought of today, and yeah, so there you go. Yeah.
The accessibility thing too, like there's going to be more people who are like going to have similar experiences if they're playing football, playing basketball, baseball, whatever it is. The competition is going to be higher. So like for every, so there's a baseball player currently named Vladimir Guerrero Jr., who is dad Vladimir.
I've seen Vladimir Guerrero Sr. play for Montreal?
Yeah, he was an Expo. Yeah. His son is also one of the best hitters in baseball right now.
Oh, fantastic.
So for every one of those, there's 10 or 12 other Dominican kids who came up with like wildly different circumstances and are as good or better than him. Just again, because there's more people who play baseball and have access to like to the path that would get you to Formula One or even Formula 2 grid.
Yeah, I should point out that, I mean, it will help you only so far, because as you say, but you then have to perform. You have to be brilliant when you're at the top, because I mean, obviously Max Verstappen is absolutely brilliant. Mick Schumacher is obviously also brilliant, but he's just not quite brilliant enough to sort of make it really stick in Formula One. But he's obviously in the top, really high level of drivers in the world. So yeah, you still have to really nail it yourself. You can't live off it for more than the first race in Formula One.
Yeah, and in his defense, I think his like first full-time gig in Formula One was with Haas.
Oh yeah.
American team, woo, we stink. Yeah, but yeah, I'm trying to think what else I want to ask. Like, this is not really good. I think I may steer this towards, because like I wanted to focus on 2021 and that last race in Abu Dhabi.
Oh yeah.
Verstappen and Hamilton, but like if it turns into a Max Verstappen episode, that's great. I think that's really interesting. Because I think he's an interesting guy, and just like his sort of ruthlessness now, which has always been there, but now he has a car that's better than everybody else's to go along with like skills and abilities that are better than everybody else's.
Yeah, it's not all about ruthlessness as well, though. I mean, there's a good example just a few years ago. Nico Rosberg, when he won the championship in 2016, he was up against Lewis Hamilton in the same Mercedes, and he'd been up against him for a few years and always been almost there. By the way, that's another son of a world champion, Nico Rosberg, incidentally. But he was a really, really, really top level driver, and yet he wasn't quite doing it against Lewis. But then in that year, 2016, he basically gave himself a mental overhaul. He went to Kyoto in Japan, spoke to an expert on meditation, learnt meditation techniques, used this sort of techniques of meditation and mindfulness throughout that year to keep resetting himself, to keep himself absolutely at the highest level mentally he possibly could for that entire season. And he just did it. He just held on to the sort of last laps of the finale in Abu Dhabi, and you could hear him on the radio the last few laps because it was still tense. He still had Lewis right behind him. He could have sort of managed to find a way past, and just those last few laps, you could hear it in the desperation in his voice. Guys, help me out here. We've done it. We're basically going to win the world championship. And then, but by sort of completely overhauling, he had a mental trainer as well through that year. By completely overhauling that, and sort of just learning to let go during the races, and yet he then just did enough to win that world title. And then he retired from the sport a few days later because he knew that he was spent. That's what it takes to beat somebody like Lewis Hamilton in the same car, because if you can't, and then you're not going to do it more than once. So he knew that, and then poof, out we go. But he did it. He did enough to get the dream that he'd always dreamt of.
Is he a presenter now? Making that up? Like, is he?
Yeah, he does. But then a lot of ex-Formula 1 drivers do end up presenting in one way or another. But it also shows the power of dreams. Dreams are critical in this, because not just the big dream. All the guys that we see in Formula 1 now have dreamt of being Formula 1 drivers for their entire lives and really focused on it. And not just sort of, I'm going to win the world championship, but also then you focus on, okay, what am I going to do for the next year? Okay, I've got to be in Formula 3, whatever. And then, okay, what am I going to do for the next month? Okay, I've got to focus on improving my pace, make sure I get, the results for the next month. What am I going to do for the next week? What am I going to do for the next day? What am I going to do for the next half hour just before qualifying? And you see, visualization, I don't know how much you've done on that, but visualization is such a huge part of sport, and it's a massive part of Formula 1 as well. And you see so many of them sort of sitting in the pits before they go out for qualifying or whatever, with their eyes shut, focusing in. That's very much something Senna did, and it's something that people like Vettel have all done. And I spoke to Charles Leclerc quite recently about that. He's been doing it again his entire career because it's known about now, whereas going back, it's sort of this only became sort of a common thing in maybe the 70s, 80s, and these days they're all doing it. And it's not just in this sport, but it's all sports. But visualization is key. So the big dream is the big one. Then you break it down into smaller and smaller chunks. And the power of visualization is that it actually isn't just about kind of rehearsing and being ready for what comes. It somehow manages to steer the future. Honestly, the stories I've heard about people visualizing something, sort of, if you write down, I'm gonna do such and such a time at such and such a place, and then they do it. And Michael Phelps is a good example actually from swimming. He dreamt big. He wanted to change the whole sport of swimming, but then he also in his training sessions he used to specify split times for every single kind of lap of the pool he did. And so and he used to hit them, relentlessly. It's amazing how the power of the mind is huge.
Yeah, the visual is. I have one more question after this, but the visualization piece is interesting because throughout the show, there's a couple different times that I remember Pierre Gasly doing it. I think there are a couple people who also did it, but these guys play Formula 1 video games. That's part of their visualization process. Is I'm going to Barcelona next week. I can race that track in my living room to kind of get, okay, this is what this turn looks like. This is where I want to bank here. It's obviously different when they actually get in the physical car, but that is an interesting psychological technique that a lot of them are employing, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean that, and also video games have been around for at least 30 years at a reasonably good level, and they've obviously got better and better and better. But all the teams also, to go back to your earlier question about what the teams do, they all have simulators as well, which are the highest possible level of simulation they can get. And so, particularly, I mean, that's basically the only way drivers can practice on the places where they're going to go between races, and it's a huge part of the sport. Yeah. Although, just to go back to Nico Rosberg, one thing he said that he'd grown used to not doing anything between the races in terms of driving, but that one year, 2016, he got a kart, and just between races, he started karting again, and he just used to spend every spare minute he could karting around. Obviously, not the actual circuits he was going to go to, but just to keep the whole feel of it, because Formula One is a sport where you do it for 3 days or whatever at the weekend, and then you've got to stop. You're traveling around the world. And then you come back and you're supposed to go straight back into the car and nail it again. He decided, okay, I'm just going to really kind of keep this guy. So no wonder he's so tired at the end of the week, at the end of the year.
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and you mentioned it briefly, is one of the things that was like the most alien to me, I think, about the whole Formula One dynamic is the team structure in terms of like the two drivers themselves. Because I had just done a video when I started this about the Tour de France, and like, they also have teams, but it is a wildly different set of expectations for the people on that team. Because, like, in a Formula One race, if you have, Checo Perez and Max Verstappen in the same race, there's an expectation that towards the end of the race, like, if it's Max or Checo, Checo's getting out of the way so that Max can go. And Checo's probably not going to be very happy about that. But, like, that's just kind of the way it works. Whereas that's part of the plan in the Tour de France. Like, you have your domestiques who will absolutely kill themselves going up a mountain just so their teammate can have a chance to win the stage or take time in the GC, whatever. So like, is that in your experience, having been around these guys, is that weird? Like that sort of like dynamic between teammates? What does that look like close up?
It's really weird. I mean, especially in teams where it's not explicitly, said that this is exactly what's going to happen, mate. And one of the big problems with Formula One is that sometimes we're in a situation where only one team is blowing everybody out of the water. And the temptation has always been in Formula One, you focus all in on your lead guy. But some teams have done it better than others, where they, particularly that was keep going back to Nico Rosberg, but that's an example of a team which basically let its two guys race. They were the class of the field by miles, and to keep the sport interesting, they let their two guys race. There was a team back in the early 2000s, Ferrari, in the Michael Schumacher era, were very much the other way around. Everything was going towards Michael Schumacher, which is fine again in the years where the team wasn't blowing everybody out of the water. But when they had the best car by miles, it just it has a problem for the sport, because the sport becomes it's not sport anymore. If you've got two guys who can only ever win a race and only one of them's ever going to win the race, it's just like, so. I mean, Red Bull isn't quite to that extreme, but it becomes really tricky. If you're a number two driver, you're obviously a brilliant driver. Checo Perez is a brilliant driver, and so was Rubens Barrichello back in the day. But yeah, if you're being blown away, or even if you're not being blown away, you only have to be like 2 or 3 tenths down on your teammate, maybe in qualifying, and yeah, the sort of the pain of trying to constantly battle that, and then not knowing how, and then particularly if the team, then you can feel the team edging away from you and just giving everything to the other guy to make sure, the other guy do it. I mean, it's really tough. You've only got your team backing you up out there. To be a number two driver in Formula One is, I mean, okay, you can take all the other side benefits, but all these people want to win. That's the thing they're there for. I mean, all the, you can have a great lifestyle, whatever. That's not what it's about. They want to, they grew up, they reached Formula One because they won. They won in karts. They won in the lower formulae. They won, and they won, and they won, and they're obviously brilliant. And then they get there, and then they just have to settle for, I mean, the pain, you can feel the pain on some of these radio messages when it has happened, where they're finally ahead of the guy. They've done everything right. They're set there to win the race or whatever, and then they have to give way. God, can you imagine that? If that's your entire life, what you've always dreamt of is to sort of be up there doing that, and you've given everything to be there, and you have to give it away. Yeah. So weird. Yeah, definitely it's weird. It's in that respect, it's a really weird sport.